This is Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. In each episode, we bring you information, insights, ideas, and interviews from some of the industry's top thought leaders. Head to mediasalesmastery.com to help pick the topic and guide the show.
This is Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. I'm your host, Jamie Wood. Our topic today, interrogating the brief. In media sales, and particularly within the agency side of media sales, a brief represents the first critical stage in a potential revenue opportunity. The ability to review a brief thoughtfully, to understand, to extract key pieces of information, and then to translate that brief into your own media solution is a critical skill set. It takes time, it takes practice to develop it, to master it, but it pays massive dividends when done right. I speak to media salespeople a lot through this podcast and in my day job. They rattle off a lot of the same issues time and time again.
This brief didn't have enough information. It was just budget, timing, target audience, and a due date.
The brief was too fluffy. It had a bunch of graphs, jargon, nothing tangible for me to take away from it. Like, it's great to have background, but what is my channel supposed to do?
The brief was 6 pages long and full of intricate detail that my editorial team didn't care about and couldn't work with.
Or the very common, I really struggle to set the room up for a brainstorm when the brief is a 3-page document. Everyone's eyes glaze over. So, our returning guest today is Julian Cole. Now, he did an episode with us last year. He has a newsletter called Planning Dirty. I would encourage anybody in the media sector to subscribe to this newsletter. I'm going to let him talk more about a specific niche that he operates in as a consultant, but he's also the perfect guest to talk on this very particular topic today because he has a broad understanding of all stakeholders in the media value chain. It's going to be a great episode. Really looking forward to this one.
The first 5.
Julian, welcome back.
It's great to be back. Thanks for having me.
No, you were a very popular episode guest last time, mate. So it was our pleasure to have you here. Tell us, what have you been working on since we last spoke about a year ago?
So I've been really going all in on the Planning Dirty Academy. So I think last year I was kind of consulting half my time as a strategy consultant, the other half kind of teaching and coaching in the Planning Dirty Academy, which is helping strategists kind of learn the fundamentals of strategy. And that has been really my focus. I feel like the Academy's grown. There's been over 1,000 members in there. And I have been able to see, massive changes in a lot of those strategists kind of going from like social strategists or media planners to now being strategists in their own right, kind of losing the prefix and feeling like they can do strategy across the whole advertising remit.
I mean, I've been keeping an eye on the Planning Dirty newsletter. And again, I run a team that are predominantly a media sales team. There are definitely some cross-functional people. There are people who work in strategy and solutions. But I think I made this insight last time that whilst you are speaking to a very specific audience, a lot of the content you put out has such a broad utility across any role in the media value chain. And I'm really kind of hoping that after we had our last episode, a lot of the listening audience really subscribed to the newsletter and started to engage with some of your content because it does have relevance beyond just the world of strategy.
Yeah, I think you're right. Everyone does strategy. Strategy is putting a plan together. And I think if you think you need the title of strategist in to be doing the strategy, then you're kind of wrong. It shouldn't just be that person. And there's so much to it. It's all about kind of selling in great work and making that happen, great creative work happen. And I think everyone's a part of that, accountable to that.
I agree. And hence why we sort of arrived at this very specific topic today of interrogating the brief. I mean, you cover the topic of briefs, particularly creative briefs, in a lot of detail on Planning Dirty. And, the general kind of vibe I get is that this step in the process is actually the source of a lot of angst and frustration for people. Is that a fair comment? And if so, why is that the case?
Yeah, I think that it is a massive kind of bugbear and issue for a lot of people because no one's really trained on what a creative brief is. And, when I started my career, I definitely wasn't trained to write a creative brief, except I was expected to write one. And that is kind of the biggest problem for me. And that's what I've been trying to address. So there's some simple things like a client brief is not a creative brief, which is kind of needs to be stated a couple of times, because a lot of people think, oh, why do we need a creative brief if the clients have already written a brief? Well, there's a big difference. When the client's writing the brief, they're fundamentally writing it as the business case, the reason why we need advertising. Where when you're writing the creative brief, you're actually writing it from the consumer's perspective. What do we need to tell the consumer? What's their problem? And how are we helping them to overcome that problem with our product or service? And it's looking at it from a very different angle. From the client brief, that's looking at it from the business problem. What's the problem for the business? From the creative brief, it's looking at it from the consumer's eyes. And so those are two different documents. And the creatives, that's whether you're giving them that brief or you're just giving them the client brief, that's the work they have to do. They have to make that logical leap of moving it over from what's the problem for the business to what's the problem for the consumer.
You know, to overlay that with another degree of complexity, my observation working on publisher side is that we often become very good at selling our inventory, right? So we're in a situation where we're doing a transaction with a business or an agency where they give us a brief, they give us the metrics of success that they want to evaluate the brief against, and then we sort of come back and we really package our inventory and we build value propositions and we run audience reach. And I just worry oftentimes as an industry, we really lose sight of the fact that what we are actually trying to collectively achieve here is business growth through intercepting and influencing consumer behavior, you know, and converting that to brand metrics. I've always felt there's a disconnect there, and it's something that as a media industry, we need to keep an eye on. And it's probably what led me to the first question in the main topic.
Media sales mastery.
Because a client brief to a creative agency, a strategy brief to a creative team, a media agency brief to a media supplier, these are all fundamentally different in terms of the output required. But in your observation, mate, like, are there shared traits? Are there things that form a great brief in any form?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say let's start with the differences, and then, you know, maybe between us we can work out what the similarities are, because I'm not going to claim to be an expert on the media sales side of things, but I'd say the biggest difference, the first difference that I see between the two briefs is the target consumer. So I often talk about it as the consumption target and the desired target. And for me, the consumption target is probably what you see more in the media briefs. It's demographics that we know that we can win against in a lot of cases, and the eyeballs that we can reach. Where a desired target is more closer in on what's the pain point that all these people share, the similarities. And it's, to me, less demographic and more around the problem that they have. So let's take an example here. If we go, there's the Spotify case study that I really love, where they were trying to target Gen Xers. They realized Gen Xers spend a lot of money on music, but they're not spending any money on Spotify. So the information that we gave in the creative brief for this campaign was that when you, after the age of 34, you start listening to more old music, which is more than a year old, than new music that's published in the last year. And that makes you starting to feel irrelevant. And, you know, it's a little bit of a tension in culture, because when you're in your 20s, you feel like you're relevant. And now you're like, wow, the world's kind of racing past me. The desired audience there, that tension of, oh, I'm not cool anymore, is what we want to know about the consumer from a creative perspective. But if we go from the media angle of that, the media angle is, well, I actually want to get to consumers when they're thinking about choosing a music. So for them, they actually chose out-of-home boards on the commuter path. And that made sense from that angle, because you can get the consumption target. You can get commuters. We know we can get them in a broad sense. We probably know that they're living out in the suburbs now. So there's certain billboards that are going to be attracted to them. But that's the consumption target. But as we see with the desired target, it's quite different. It's more about the tension of feeling irrelevant, even though it's the same audience. So that's my first difference, I would say, between the two.
It's surprising, and just reflecting on that, I think from the media sales point of view, you're absolutely right. The consumption target's usually what's in the brief. Or I should say, I beg your pardon, like it's typically a demographic that the advertiser's going for. Can you deliver this audience at scale, or can you deliver them in a contextually relevant environment? You know, what's your method of intercepting them? And to your point there, which was a great one around that really actionable insight or identifying that tension, oftentimes I just think that's a step that the media salesperson, particularly one tasked with actually developing the creative for a campaign, they almost leave out. They don't devote enough time to actually going, well, we understand we can reach this audience en masse, but let's actually think about some actionable consumer insights that can then inform the creative direction, or the creative brief that we then deliver to our internal people.
Or even to me, like I would love to hear your perspective on this, because this is the one thing that I feel gets left out a lot in it's a missing step that we miss a lot in the creative production process, which is there's a stage where we have the creative idea and we miss the opportunity to bring the idea to life through media channels. So I'll give you an example. When I was at BBH, we worked on this brand called Cole Haan. And so it was female shoes. They were called the Chelsea Pumps. And what they had in them is they had Nike Air technology. So it was a much more comfortable shoe. And so when you're in New York, that was where the campaign was. We wanted to tell people, we realized that your shoes are often the thing that stop you from going out 16 hours a day. You can't, that's the thing that's going to say, hey, you've got to go home now. Where what we wanted to say is, don't let your shoes be the thing that stops you from going home. So we had a campaign called Don't Go Home. And the whole idea there was, and this is where I think it was so smart, the media that it showed up in was all in that 16th hour, that hour of when people want to go home. So all the messages and the advertising was on the roller doors in New York. So everything that you're pulling down. And we also had like a food truck, a late night food truck that was only open from like 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock, because we knew that that's how people refueled and stayed out. So everything was communicating, all the media was communicating that idea. The problem is that we often, in creative agencies, and that was my job, was really, where are the moments in media where this could come to life? And we would often present these ideas, which would be media relevant, but we always struggle to actually make them happen. And I know that like 80% of the media buy is always locked, but why can't we get to ideas like that?
Well, the first thing I'd say, and we have this tension all the time, and I'll reflect on my time in radio, because I actually did a webinar with a radio group out of Sri Lanka just last week, and I was really helping them with better commercialization of their digital offering, right? Now, that's a really interesting area to talk about in radio, and I'll nerd out here for a bit. My kind of, I guess, thoughts back to that group was to say, what you're trying to do is you're going to the market with an inventory-led proposition. You want to better monetize your digital assets, right? What you need to do is you need to completely invert the way you think about your proposition, and you need to think about what's really valuable to the audience. It's your brands, it's that they're trusted, they're known, people understand what a radio brand is in terms of attitude, in terms of maybe the content. It's your talent and the relationship they have with the audience, and it's the ecosystem that you surround that with. It's all the digital touch points. So think about how you can extend those things across the different touch points you have. And think about a day in the life, to your point, a day in the life of a consumer. We used to famously go to market and say radio was the first media touch point of the day. It's where people would get their news, their traffic, their weather, their information. I mean, most people wake up and scroll through their social feeds. So what are we doing to capitalize on that with our station socials? What role does your desktop and your station website play while people are at their desk eating lunch and maybe streaming your radio station? What role does podcasting play in the evening during found time while people are cooking or cleaning? What are people doing in the evenings while they're relaxing? Maybe they're watching a social video. So think about what happens in a typical day and all the different opportunities to engage your audience via all your different platforms. And then when you're attacking a client brief, have a think about where you can integrate the brand into those touch points in a way that's meaningful. And I get that it sounds a bit complex what I'm saying here, but that's a real aspirational, I guess, thing for a lot of media salespeople, is to go, how do I deliver a solution across the vast array of different touch points that my radio brand has, and how do I tell that story across these different assets? Some people can nail it, but the challenge oftentimes is when you are responding to a brief, the metrics are so clear around what the media performance needs to be that it's at complete odds with those types of responses to brief. And so how do we fix it? I don't know. I think a lot of it's just proactivity and going out and really showcasing that offering enough to people so that they start to buy into that type of sales approach. But it's an ongoing challenge, mate. I don't think there's really an answer to it. And I can hear your frustration, because I think from the outside looking in, you might be looking at all these great ideas going, wow, look at all the toys this media organization has to play with, and I'd love for them to just rip into this idea and come back with a recommendation. And then maybe what you come back with feels a bit diluted. Is that sort of your experience or observation?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the level that I get it on is the media plan. And so the media agency is coming back on your behalf, out of home radio here. And you look at it and you think, we've told you what this creative idea is, so for instance, we've told you that if we go to the Spotify example, you're feeling irrelevant. When are the moments when people feel irrelevant or cool? And you've just come back with a buy that, has got nothing to do with that. Now in your new role, or even at radio, when did you speak to creative agencies? Or like when you think back to your most ambitious projects where you partnered with creative agencies, how did that happen? Who reached out to who?
Oh, look, as a general rule, and I hate to say it, as a general rule, neither side of the fence does it well. Creative agencies don't foster good relationships with media suppliers, and media suppliers don't engage either. Many times, unfortunately, mate, it's an afterthought. It's more tactical or executional. So if you're talking as a media supplier about creative executions, you're talking dimensions, you're talking formats, you're talking specs. Rarely are those rich opportunities for collaboration available between media and creative. That being said, there are some exceptions to the rule, particularly the pro bono work, the charity stuff. Oftentimes that's where I think the creative agencies will really try to bring the media in early, because that's oftentimes where, maybe the parameters of the brief can be a bit more open. They can use it to flex a bit more creative muscle, because it's not necessarily a paid investment by a client. It's a pro bono thing. But as a general rule, I think, again, it really comes down to having more of those high level discussions to just inform better work on both sides of the fence.
It's almost the client needs to bring you together. Or the only area I'd say, in my experience, was with a lot of the startup brands. I mean, startups, biggest startups now, tech companies like the Googles, Facebooks, Spotifys of the world. I feel like their sales team have got so much money that they'll have what they call like creative strategist in at Facebook or Google, and they will be assigned to our agency, and they'll come in and do lunch and learns, and then they'll come in and work side by side with creatives. And that was the way that we saw it working. But I think it was definitely a demand from the client too. The client being, hey, we're not, we don't think you get social, so you need to sit down with Facebook and come up with something amazing on Facebook. Sometimes that was how it was being led.
That's a really good call out. I think in fairness, we definitely have great relationships, working collaboratively across a number of briefs. I think it's just one of those things where I probably see a missed opportunity, and I just wish we'd push more into that territory as almost the status quo is that we collaborate heavily with creative and media as a media supplier, even with the client and potentially their in-house creative teams. We're in an interesting market in the last 12 months where the response times have more than halved. There's a real tendency towards that functional, tactical advertising. There's a real focus on de-risking investment and going for the, those proven channels that we know deliver results, and maybe being a bit gun shy about pushing out into other territory. So it's something I think we have to keep an eye on, mate. But it's great, and it's interesting hearing your perspective. And I suppose if I jump back into some of the questions I had from the audience, one of the things that I think is really probably just a real simple thing, but a good reset, is from maybe a media salesperson's perspective that does get briefs coming in many forms. We're typically the catch point, so we'll get it from a client or an agency, and we're that representative of that media organization. What does the process of really reviewing a brief of any type look like to you? When you're reviewing a brief, is there a particular process you undertake? Is there a methodology to it? Is there an optimum way to do it so that you can really fully understand that brief?
What I will do is a couple of things. So let me tell you the end point that I end up. So a client brief will, again, be the business information. So in that, what I want to see, and I'm actually working on a document, hopefully, which is the ideal client brief. So I'm trying to find a template and give that to people. But in that, you'll have the business goal, the business problem, the target consumer, the timing, and the budget. Like they're your 5 key pieces. What I'm translating that into is a creative brief, which I often refer to as the get who to buy. That was what I used at BBDO, which is a famous kind of creative brief format. The get is the target consumer, who you want to actually move. The who, what you put after the who statement, is the consumer problem. The to is the goal, and the buy is the single-minded proposition, the one thing. So that is where I'm trying to take the business brief and I'm trying to move it all the way over to the creative brief.
That's an amazing framework. I mean, I know I've actually probably stolen that from you in the past in some brainstorms, because, I mean, if you use it in that Spotify example from before, it would be sort of get Gen Xers who listen to old music and are feeling irrelevant to, I suppose, engage with Spotify or engage with a streaming platform by targeting them in contextually relevant environments on the commute, or at times they feel irrelevant. Is that sort of, like, is that really how you typically try to put something into a framework as part of what the actual core brief is?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So, I mean, how workable is that, right? Like, think about how 4 or 5 pages in a brief with all this background could be so quickly condensed into the core 4 takeouts like that. I mean, I don't want us to lose sight of how actually valuable that tool would be for people selling media.
Yeah, I definitely think it is. The biggest, and I can tell you the couple of watch outs that I always see around this brief that might be helpful for the listeners is with strategy. What strategy is you've got a goal, a problem, and where you are in your audience and where you want to move them. Now, the biggest thing that people skip over, and I did this as a junior strategist too, is the problem statement. A lot of people miss the problem statement, and that is the most important part of the brief. So, in the rush for a new client to come to us, they'll say, hey, we've got this new product. It's a new drone, and it's got the best camera on it in the market. It's going to be an amazing camera, best, the flying time. It's faster than any other drone on the market, and it lands perfectly. Now, we could go off and go, okay, well, the brief's around faster. We need to show faster in different ways. What are media environments that are faster? Now, the problem is that you're missing the consumer problem. And without that, it really loses its teeth, because why is faster important? That's the thing that we need to answer. And that's often where the client skips it, because the other problem with a lot of clients is they're thinking about their product 24/7, not the average consumer. The average consumer is not thinking about buying a drone all their life. But when you're in it, you're in the category, you're living and breathing. It's impossible not to, when you meet the media team or the creative team, to burst with excitement about the speed of this new drone. But what we've got to do is really, and that's what the job often is really stepping back, working out what is the consumer problem here? What are we actually addressing? Why do we need faster drones? Well, it's all around like you don't want to get caught. You want to take the cheeky shot that doesn't get caught, or is the speed around, you're moving too fast. The jet, you've got a jet ski or something and you're trying to record a jet ski. Understand what the problem is, because then that makes a tighter brief. The reason I think other people miss it is they just don't want to be too negative. But you've got to have something. You've got to have a little bit of tension in your creative brief, because if we don't know what we're solving, why are we even advertising?
Again, this is kind of a broad catch-all term, but this is where I think people think insight is almost kind of the problem, and it's actually a bit of both, isn't it? Like articulating the problem and potentially identifying an actionable consumer insight. Those two can kind of be one and the same, but can also be a part of solving the problem. Is that right?
Yeah. So when I think of the word insight, because it gets bandied around a lot, an insight is a revelation. Now, Richard Huntington, who's the president of Saatchi, I'm stealing his line, but that is what an insight is. It's a revelation. It reveals something about us, and you've never heard it before, but when you hear it, it kind of makes sense. That's true. And what it either does is, when we're researching, it either, with the problem, it either reframes the problem, so shows us a problem in a totally different way, or it shows us a surprising solution to the problem. The two examples that I always use is, there was this great ad out of Portugal, and it was an ad for people to pick up dog poo, because the problem is people are not picking up dog poo. They don't care anymore. So what they did is, the ad was showing the dog poo, but they made it look like a chocolate sundae. And the ad had, kids don't know the difference between poo and chocolate sundae, or that was kind of the message. And so what they had done there was, and you look at it and you're like, actually, it does kind of look like a sundae. I can understand how kids get this wrong. And so what they had done is they'd reframed the problem from being about pick up your dog poo because someone else is going to step in it, to the reframe the problem to, you not picking up your dog poo is going to get a kid sick, or you're risking children's health. And so they had reframed it in a totally different way with an insight, a revelation. When you think about it, dog poo does kind of look like a sundae, and you're right, that would be a risk to kids.
Yeah, you just caused me to think about one. I mean, I remember the best example, and maybe it was the gentleman you're talking about, but it was a quote, and it said, the best way to explain what an insight is to show you the difference. And it was, I'm going to misquote it, but I think it was like, a fact would be, 80% of people feed their dogs twice a day. An observation is that they typically feed their dog in the early morning and in the evening. But the insight is that people feel guilty eating their breakfast and dinner in front of their dog. And so, like, that one to me is such a great demonstration of the difference, where it's like, we're actually taking the data, but when we're going, well, what does that reveal about, what's actually happening beyond the surface here? What's the why behind this behavior? And that would lead to a completely different creative idea, I would imagine, and as would the chocolate the chocolate sundae observation. But to arrive at those problems and those insights, I dare say takes a bit of time, and it probably leads to the next question, mate. We know this idea of interrogating the brief, really unpacking or making sure that we ask those additional questions, seeking clarification, maybe even tissuing some potential approaches or ideas, testing the parameters of the brief and the client's, tolerance for that. Have you found any particular methods or techniques, helpful in order to really extract that maximum amount of usable information for the least amount of effort, because everybody has a tolerance for how many questions they want to sit and answer. Has there been any sort of shortcuts there or ways to frame questions that you found helpful?
There's a number of questions. Like, I have a list of questions that I go through, that I ask of a client. And there's just like the 40 questions that always are on the top of the list. So I don't have to rethink those questions every time. If anyone wants that list, they can DM me on Instagram and I'll send it to you. But that's the starting point. The other point that I think a lot of strategists and whoever brief writers get wrong is they think that they have to write one brief. And that's the trap. You don't write one brief. You write multiple briefs. The trap is you think you can only write one brief, so then you start stuffing in all your smart thinking into one brief, where the better way is write 3 briefs, clear ideas, clear problem, clear solution, boom, really clear. And then take that to the client, then say, hey, this is the 3 areas that I'm thinking about. What works? Or in the case of a creative agency, you take it to the creative department and say, what are you resonating around first? That's the other side of it. It's not the questions you ask. You definitely have to ask the questions on the front end, but it's that back end as well.
Well, that's a really interesting approach, because I just think reflecting on maybe the workflow in a typical media organization, like media salespeople are the catch point for the client brief, and they're often entrusted to then take that brief and relay it internally. And that would be either via some sort of internal briefing process or workflow, or in many cases, if brainstorming is part of that internal workflow for creative media solutions, they then have to take that and distill a complex brief into a tight verbal brief to a room to then inform a brainstorm. And this area seems to be, in my experience, like 11 years in radio, 15 brainstorms a week. I've had quite a bit of time in the room doing it. But this area to me seems to be where the wheels can really fall off quick. And, a lot of it, I think, is just being able to probably do a better job of what you were referring to earlier. How do we distill all of this information down into something that's workable for a room to then use to spawn ideas? What, first of all, because I know you typically like to talk about the interpersonal dynamics and the politics a lot of the time in these scenarios, as well as the process. What are some of the forces and factors that lead to this room not being set up for success, or having trouble articulating that brief in a punchy fashion? And are there any ways that you think this could be mitigated or avoided for people?
I totally know the pain as well. I'm feeling that pain, because there's a difference I've worked in 2 types of agencies, the agencies where you've got a creative department who get the brief, and then they're off in a hole coming up with creative ideas, and then you see them 6 hours before the presentation. And then I've worked at agencies which don't even have a creative department, which is probably closer to media, and you're in that room having a brainstorm. I think the thing about it is, and this is what often helps, is getting someone, this is a good exercise to do beforehand for the media sales team. Really work out what the brand is about. And if you're not a brand strategist and this isn't your easiest place, what you do is you take the tagline, and you've just got to ask either the media agency is going to give you the brand guidelines, or they're not, assuming that they're not giving you the brand guidelines. So you've got to take the line that they've used, the tagline, and see how they describe that. How do they talk about that? Then read also the last review, like Google the last ad campaign that they did, and look at how because usually they'll have like an ad campaign running wherever it is, the ad rags online, and they'll describe why this ad is so important and what's it doing. And those quotes are often very helpful. And the other place is the CEO. You can often see it in the CEO will do it in their quarterly financial reports when they're speaking to shareholders. They'll say what the creative idea is. You need to work out what are those words. And we often, some people like this, some people don't. I'll often distill it down to one sentence and then have 3 pieces that the idea has to live up to. So, for instance, when I worked on PlayStation, and we came up with the campaign Greatness Awaits. I think it was a US campaign, so I don't know if it was here. But with Greatness Awaits, we had the word, but then under it, there was the statement that all the work had to ladder up to, which was inspire, invite, and challenge gamers to their greatness. And so under that, we explained the words. So the first one was inspire, invite, and challenge. So that actually comes from the brand archetype, the magician, who, if you know the hero's journey, maybe this is too much, but the hero's journey, the magician always kind of pushes you on further. And that was the role of PlayStation. So we knew we always had to do that. We had to either invite, inspire, or challenge gamers. Gamers, we needed to show was everyone, not just one, not just the nerd sitting in the dark room in their basement. And then greatness was the kind of around the insight of the idea, which was a lot of gamers felt shame around the victories that they had online. They felt like their emotions, when you win at FIFA, it's not as valid as winning with your indoor soccer team. Like, yes, that is still, you have done something amazing there. You still have one. So we wanted to validate those emotions. So we always had to show that greatness, and we always had to honor it, saying this is actually valuable. But having those three pieces, so always invite and challenge, always have gamers, and always end in greatness and showing that emotional victory being something worthy, was really good for work, because you're like, okay, it needs to tick these three boxes. And if you can show what's in and what's out, like this type of work's out and this type of work is on brief, then that helps as well. That's a different part of it though. You've cracked the creative brief and now you've got a creative idea.
That's a really interesting insight you shared there, or suggestion around, and what I believe is actually one of the most underutilized resources for any media salesperson is annual reports that a CEO of a company will give. They'll literally give away who their customer is, the markets they're going for, what their brand's about, their values, like their strategy. It's like if you have clients in your portfolio that do updates to the share market, to shareholders, and you're not watching or streaming those reports and using that to inform how you service that client and deliver them solutions, you're missing a massive opportunity to actually better the work you do. So it was sort of an interesting side discussion there, mate, but it's a really good area of discussion because it sort of leads me to the last one, which is around, we would love to be getting great briefs. A lot of the time, that's an aspiration, is to have these great briefs coming in that spawn amazing work. But what happens if a media salesperson gets a brief that is pretty lackluster? They can interrogate it. They've tried to piece together as much disparate information as they can. Maybe it's a very one-dimensional brief that just doesn't feel like it informs creativity. I sort of thought that maybe this might lend itself to some of the content you've recently shared around the 4 Cs. Is that something that maybe you think you could unpack for us a bit? And would it potentially be a tool or a resource that could be used in times where a brief is maybe wanting for more?
Yeah, it is. I think you can still end up with a dry brief from this, but it definitely is a nice way to jump into it. And then I'm going to give you another one, which I think can get you to interesting territory. So let me explain the 4 Cs. So this is a common tool, kind of tried and true tool that's used by a lot of strategists, which is you break up your research into 4 components, which are researching the company, the culture, the customer, and the category. And you go through all of these 4, researching and really getting deep in on the knowledge around these sections. And there are questions you ask. And so you can actually start to understand, what is the real problem here? What are we trying to address? And what are we getting at? And so it's just a really nice way to, especially I find with a lot of young strategists, when they're getting a bit frazzled and feel like they're going around in circles, to have this structure is really nice. Okay, have you done your research about the company? Yep. As you were saying before, financial reports. Do I know everything there? What's happening in the category? Can we be different? What are the trends? What are the tropes of the category? Okay, good. What's happening in culture? And then what's happening on the customer's level? So it can be really helpful. The other thing I want to leave you with is a little trick that I like to play, which is called, and this is when you've got 20 minutes on a brief, the 10 minutes insight trick. And so what you do here is you get a piece of paper and you write down on one side all the features of the product, everything, just the features and the benefits. What do people get? What are the basic features? Then on the next column, you've broken it into 3 columns. The next column, what you want to do is you've hopefully got your problem right now, but you want to take all the tropes that you know about the category. Like, what does everyone say? I'm going to give you an example here. So I did this on a fruity wine. And so this wine was, a fruity wine, which actually had an expiry date on it. So that kind of was the feature that we kind of started flipping off. And one of the common tropes of the category of wine is, what does everyone say about wine? Well, wine gets better with age. Well, the interesting thing about this is what you do is you put all the tropes, and then what you do is you just write the complete reverse of that line. So that was wine gets better with youth, or wine's better younger, or
I like my wine fresh.
you like your wine fresh. And what you do is you flip these statements, and it's saying the complete opposite. And then you look and you have written down 20 statements, all the tropes, and then you flip them all to sound bizarre. Some sound just nonsense. But then you see if any are true. And for that one, we kind of landed on something there. You say, wine gets better with age. Like an expiry date's usually seen as a bad thing, but this is saying this wine's energetic. It's exciting. Like, this wine's not a boring wine. This wine's got some youth about it. It's got some energy. It's not a boring wine. And so there you're starting to, you've taken something that was, we wanted to hide the expiry date on a wine. And now you're saying, no, let's embrace that and say a youthful wine's great. Like, that's what you want. An expiry date is a sign of energy. And so a 10-minute trick, and what you're doing there is actually getting to the insight, because as we said at the start, it's a revelation. So a revelation is it's revealing something new that you didn't think was the same. So when we're doing that flipping exercise, we're actually getting to the revelation. And then what we're doing is connecting it with a feature or a benefit of the product that actually proves it out to be true. And I've used that a couple of times. I reckon 8 out of 10 times, you sometimes land on some really exciting kind of exciting insights, and it definitely can breathe a lot of life into a brief.
Well, I think if nothing else, it just helps you be a bit more contrarian to the category conventions. And particularly, I mean, in the market that I work in, there are a handful of very large clients in very particular categories. But if you've been working on those clients for 5 to 6 years, you do need those things to keep you thinking fresh and in new in ways that invigorate you and actually create opportunities to think of things in a different way. So that one to me is a phenomenal technique to potentially do that, mate.
I can't ask my sales manager that.
I've got actually a listener submit a question that I wanted to, and it sort of reflects or it sort of touches a bit on what we said. So her name's Morgan. She's a print account exec from the UK.
So I work in agency sales for a large media owner. We have a large suite of products, but our core business is print media. I work with one major agency, and they're very detailed in their briefs. They give great consumer and category insights, and they've always got a clever idea to activate the client's brand. The problem is, when it comes to print, they're very prescriptive around the role of print and what they want back. It offers no opportunity to really explore other assets or platforms to support the ideas. How would you approach this?
So, interesting one there. And I think, we've all felt this in media, and it sort of, before I sort of throw it to you, you asked me this before. Why don't media suppliers come back with potentially more interesting things on the plan? I think sometimes it's just at odds with what the actual performance metrics or the KPIs or the criteria of the media brief actually are. That would be my assessment of what seems to be happening here. But any thoughts on maybe that kind of particular challenge, how she might attack this one?
Yeah, for sure. So a couple of thoughts. The first one is you definitely need to start finding some champions over, if this is a really creative agency, you definitely need to start finding some champions over in that creative agency who want to push the boundaries on things. So you need to either back to the lunch and learn. If you find a planner in there, a strategist, and you can show, hey, we can do these amazing things on our platform, and here are some examples, they will be all ears to that. So finding the right person who's actually showing a bit of interest will be really helpful. And maybe it's not examples from your company, but it's other examples in the industry or around the world who've done something that you could execute at your company. The second part to that is do the 80-20-10 rule, which is 80% of the budget is going to go to the safe stuff. 20% will be experimental. And then the final 10% is the really out there. So what you need to show is that, hey, guys, we have got the eyeballs are going to be reached. We're going to reach them all there. But what we want to do is an experiment. We just want to do 20% or 10%, a little bit of an experiment, something a little bit more ambitious. And we know you as a creative agency want to do ambitious work. So we want to push it here. Let's use it like that. Let's find that 10% to be ambitious, to be experimental. The other thing would be reducing, and maybe this is not so much of a problem for you, but the one thing that I see with selling innovative work is a lot of people underestimate the amount of time. They say, this is not going to cost you a lot. It's not going to cost you a lot of money. But for a lot of big organizations, it's costing you a lot of time and resources. When your creative teams up to their eyeballs can't do anything more, and you're saying, hey, do this innovative thing, and it's going to, or for a marketer, you're going to have to take this through legal, and then this is going to be a massive headache. They're like, no, I just want to go see my kids. Understanding that and working out, how can we reduce the noise? How can we reduce the amount of time or input from others on this? How can we make it as turnkey as possible? It's going to be cheap cost-wise and in terms of your time as well. They would be the two things I'd be focusing on.
Mate, that's an awesome summary. I mean, I was thinking the same thing as you initially around get ahead of the market and get ahead of the brief, Morgan. Like, really try to see who holds the influence in that agency, in particular, who owns maybe the client relationship and who's receptive to innovation, and just try to kind of plant the seed with them. It's a slow burn, but it will potentially influence their receptivity when the brief lands to some of the things you can do. And to Julian's great point, and I know this more than ever, and unfortunately, the last year leading a lot of sales teams has been a lesson in sacrifice. If at the moment something you put forward on a solution is ancillary, it can't be aligned to the client's objectives, feels like it's going to create drag, is something of an indulgence, it's not necessarily going to make its way on there. And you've got to be selective. And that idea of opportunity cost and time invested, you've really got to make sure that you can balance the innovative work with, Julian's point, how much time to actually activate this or how much resources it's going to require. So really, I mean, I think that was a phenomenal solution there. And I guess to round this sort of out, mate, I really want to encourage everybody, our subscribers are growing every month. Please check Julian out, subscribe to Planning Dirty. You'll be surprised how valuable it is for you. Would also love to know, mate, maybe how they can best get in touch with you and anything that might be relevant to the audience to keep an eye out for moving forward.
Sure. So I've got a free mini course on my site, which is on planningdirty.com. So you can definitely check that out. But if you can't find that, and the best place to reach me is on Instagram, I'm at by Julian Cole, and I'm constantly sharing tools and tips for strategists there. But once again, as you've said, it's not just for people with strategy in their title, but for everyone who works in advertising. So definitely find me there and send me a DM.
Awesome, mate. I'll make sure I put a link to your Instagram and any other contact information in the show notes on this episode. And, before I let you go, the one thing I'd love to know is, anyone in the audience that's maybe struggling with interrogating the brief, is there anything you want to leave them with as maybe a parting thought, something they might be able to apply this week just to potentially start driving more towards best practice?
I think it's focusing on the problem, really making sure that we've got a problem and a solution. You're often given the solution from the client, but try to really identify and understand what the problem is.
Awesome, mate. Julian, thanks so much for making the time once again, mate. It's been a pleasure to have you. Wish you all the best. I know you're back on Australian soil now too. You're in LA when we last spoke, and then New York, and back in Oz. So pretty cool to have you back here in the same time zone. And we've got a lot of people who live in Australia, so definitely check him out. I know that Julian's just a really, really kind of approachable guy who's always happy to have a chat too. So, mate, thank you again for your time. We wish you all the best for Planning Dirty and everything else you're doing, and hope to have you back soon.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. head to mediasalesmastery.com to help pick the topic, guide the show, and don't forget to subscribe to receive new episodes each week.